So welcome to Unit 14, Social Psychology. This is Module 77, Prejudice and Discrimination. And these slides align with Myers Psychology for the AP course 3rd edition. They're the ones that go with the textbook. So the learning targets for this module are to define prejudice and describe how explicit and implicit prejudice differ, discuss the groups that are frequent targets of prejudice, and discuss some social, emotional, and cognitive roots of prejudice and some ways to potentially eliminate prejudice. So what is the term prejudice? We hear it all the time. Well, from the perspective of psychology, prejudice is an unjustifiable and usually negative attitude toward a group and its members. It generally involves stereotype beliefs, negative feelings, and a predisposition toward discriminatory action. The word itself means prejudgment. It is an unjustifiable and usually negative attitude toward a group and its members. Not always, but they're often people of a particular racial or ethnic group, gender, sexual orientation, or belief system. Some of the factors that are involved in prejudice are negative emotions, stereotypes, and predisposition to discriminate. So by negative emotions, we're thinking holding emotions such as hostility or fear. Stereotypes are generalized beliefs about a group of people, and predisposition to discriminate means acting in negative and unjustifiable ways towards members of a particular group. So what's the difference between prejudice, stereotypes, and discrimination? Well, prejudice is a negative belief, often supported by stereotypes. For example, a belief that all elderly people are forgetful and that Jan, an 85-year-old, must be forgetful because she is old would be a type of stereotype. Discrimination is a negative behavior. So choosing not to date a person because of their race or not hiring a person because of their age would be considered discrimination. Ethnocentrism is assuming the superiority of one's own ethnic group. To believe that a person of another ethnicity is somehow inferior or threatening because they're a member of a different group, and to feel dislike for that person is to be prejudiced. So what's the difference between implicit and explicit prejudice? Well, the brain processes thoughts, memories, and attitudes on two different tracks. Think back in some of our earlier modules if you've listened along on those. Dual processing would be the term that we use for that. Sometimes that processing is explicit on the radar screens. We are aware that it is happening, but more often it is implicit, an unthinking, knee-jerk response operating below the radar, sort of leaving us unaware of how our attitudes are influencing our behavior. Unconscious prejudices can actually lead us to discriminate, even when people don't consciously intend to discriminate. That's the idea of implicit prejudice. So how do psychologists test for this idea of implicit prejudice? Well, they've designed tests in which people quickly pair a person's image with a trait to demonstrate that even people who don't think they have any racial prejudices may actually harbor some negative associations. And the most famous example of this type of test is the implicit association test, and there's the website for it right there if you'd like to check it out. So what research has been conducted on implicit prejudice? In one experiment, white university women assessed flawed student essays they believed had been written by either a white or a black student. The women gave low evaluations, often with harsh comments to the essays supposedly written by a white student. When the same essay was attributed to a black student, their assessment was more positive. So how might body language indicate prejudice? Even people who consciously express their prejudice may give off telltale signs as their body responds selectively to an image of a person from another ethnic group. Neuroscientists can detect signals of implicit prejudice in the viewer's facial muscle responses and in the activation of the emotion processing amygdala. If you do go on and take the AP exam, here's a tip from the publishers of the textbook, the Myers Psychology for the AP Course 3rd Edition textbook. It's worth spending a little time focusing on the distinction between these three very important terms, between stereotype, prejudice, and discrimination. They're all related to each other, but they are different terms, so being able to distinguish them in examples is important. So how have Americans' racial attitudes changed over the last century? Pretty significantly. Support for interracial dating between Blacks and whites has increased dramatically from 48% approval in 1987 to 86% approval in 2012. So if racial attitudes are changing, where does subtle prejudice still linger? So people with darker skin tones experience greater criticism and accusations of immoral behavior, according to this study by Alter et al. In 2016. Hoffman et al. In 2016 found in one study of white medical students and residents, 1 in 3 believed Black people's skin is thicker than white people's skin, which led them to make harmful treatment recommendations. And in this final research noted here, although many people say they would feel upset with someone making racist or homophobic slurs, they respond indifferently when they actually hear prejudice-laden language. So how does race prime perceptions? In certain experiments done by Keith Payne in 2006, people viewed a white or Black face, immediately followed by a flashed gun or a hand tool, which was then followed by a masking screen. So priming people with a flashed Black face rather than a white face made them more likely to misperceive a flashed tool as a gun. So how do perceptions reflect implicit bias? In 1999, Amadou Diallo was accosted as he approached his apartment house doorway by police officers who were looking for a rapist. When he pulled out his wallet, the officers, perceiving a gun, riddled his body with 19 bullets from 41 shots. The killing of Trayvon Martin, who's shown here 7 months before he was killed, revealed implicit race bias and started a national conversation about race, gun control, and other issues related to social justice. So as Trayvon had walked alone to his father's fiance's house in a gated Florida neighborhood, a suspicious resident started following him. A confrontation led to the unarmed Martin being shot. Trayvon Martin's death sparked significant public outrage, and people wondered, had Martin been an unarmed white teen, would he have been perceived and treated in the same way? That's a question that many people still wonder about. How has gender prejudice changed over time? Overt gender prejudice has declined sharply. The 1/3 of Americans who in 1937 told Gallup pollsters that they would vote for a qualified woman who their party nominated for president soared to 95% in 2012, so significant changes. 65% of all people now say it is very important that women have the same rights as men. How does implicit gender prejudice persist? Well, in Western countries, we pay more to those, usually men, who care for our streets than to those women who usually, and these are stereotypes, because there are men and women who do for different types of roles, but there's different pay depending on different types of jobs. Gender bias even applies to beliefs about intelligence. Despite equality between the sexes in intelligence scores, people have tended to perceive their fathers as more intelligent than their mothers and sons as brighter than their daughters. How does sexual orientation prejudice persist? Well, explicit anti-gay prejudice, though declining in Western countries, still persists. When experimenters sent thousands of responses to employment ads, those whose resumes included Treasurer, Progressive, and Socialist Alliance received more replies than did resumes that specified Treasurer, Gay, and Lesbian Alliance. So what do the numbers show? In national surveys of LGBTQ teens, 39% reported having been rejected by a friend or family member because of their sexual orientation or gender. 58% reported being subject to slurs or jokes. 80% of LGBTQ adolescents reported sexual orientation-related harassment in the prior year. Gays and lesbians are also America's most at-risk group for hate crimes, according to that research that was listed. So prejudice against Muslims. In the aftermath of the 9/11 terrorist attacks, the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and the rise of terrorist groups such as ISIS, many Americans have developed irrational fear and anger directed toward Muslims, or people that they think may be Muslims. So shifting gears a little bit, we're going to talk about the just world phenomenon, which is an important concept to understand. It's the tendency for people to believe that the world is just or fair, and that people therefore get what they deserve and deserve what they get. So you can see the small fish being eaten by the medium fish being eaten by the big fish. There is no justice in the world, says the small fish. There's some justice in the world, says the medium fish, and the world is just, says the big fish. So the just world phenomena reflects the common idea that good is rewarded and evil is punished. It's easy then to assume that those who succeed must be good and those who suffer must be bad. This reasoning, for example, might enable the rich to see both their own wealth and the poor's misfortune as justly deserved. When slavery existed in the United States, slaveholders perceived slaves as innately lazy, ignorant, and irresponsible, as having the very traits that justified enslaving them. So in-group versus out-group. So we think of the in-group as us, people with whom we share a common identity. For example, your athletic team, your ethnicity, the region that you're from, or even your sex. The out-group is the them, those perceived as different or apart from our in-group. For example, your rival high school, those kids over there, or the other sex. So what is in-group bias? Once we have identified us and them, an in-group bias, a favoring of our own group soon follows. In experiments, people have favored their own group when dividing rewards. Outside the lab, discrimination is often triggered not by out-group hostility, but by in-group networking and support, such as hiring a friend's child at the expense of other candidates. So when facing death, fearing threats, or experiencing frustration, people cling more tightly to their in-group and their friends. As fears of terrorism heighten patriotism, they also produce loathing and aggression toward the out-group, the them, those who threaten our world. And from that can follow this term called scapegoating, the theory that prejudice offers an outlet for anger by providing someone to blame. Scapegoat theory notes that when things go wrong, finding someone to blame can provide a target for our negative emotions. So for instance, following the 9/11 attacks, some outraged people lashed out at innocent Arab Americans, and more than a decade later, anti-Muslim animosities still can flare. So what evidence exists for the scapegoating theory of prejudice? Well, number one, economically frustrated people tend to express heightened prejudice. And number two, experiments that create temporary frustration intensify prejudice. Students who experience failure or are made to feel insecure often restore their self-esteem by belittling a rival school or another person. How do we cognitively simplify the world? Well, stereotype beliefs are a byproduct of how we cognitively want to simplify the world around us. To help us understand the world around us, we sometimes form categories. Chemists categorize molecules as sort of organic or inorganic, and a basketball coach categorizes players as guards and post players, offensive players as guards and post players, and therapists categorize psychological disorders. We all categorize people by gender, ethnicity, race, age, and many other characteristics. It's our way of simplifying the world around us. So how can categories lead to stereotypes? When we categorize people into groups, we often stereotype that group. We recognize how greatly we differ from other individuals in our groups, but we overestimate the extent to which members of other groups are alike. We perceive out-group homogeneity, which is uniformity of out-group attitudes, personality, and appearance. We tend to think that others are them, or, we think of them as them, and that they're very similar, that they're all kind of alike. Everybody that goes to that rival high school, they all have this type of personality, or everybody that cheers for this type of sports team, they all have this type of personality. So the other race effect is the tendency to recall faces of one's own race more accurately than faces of other races. It's also called the cross-race effect and own race bias. Our greater recognition for individual own race faces, called the other race effect, emerges during infancy between 3 and 9 months of age. We also have an own age bias with better recognition memory for faces of our own age group. So what research has been conducted on mixed race recognition? So when New Zealanders quickly classified 104 photos by race, those of European descent more often than those of Chinese descent classified the ambiguous middle two as Chinese. So if you look at this, this is a computer-generated morphing of faces, and you can see that the middle two are of mixed race, and those of European descent more often than those of Chinese descent classified the ambiguous middle two as Chinese. So researchers believe this happens because after learning the features of a familiar race group, the observer's selective attention is drawn to the distinctive features of the less familiar minority. So the availability heuristic is a problem-solving method in which people estimate the likelihood of events based on how fast they come to mind, their availability in memory. And it can be helpful, but it can also cause problems. If instances come readily to mind because of their vividness, we presume that they are more common, which can lead to stereotypes. So how do easily remembered vivid cases feed stereotypes? In one experiment, researchers showed two groups of University of Oregon students lists containing information about 50 men. The first group's list included 10 men arrested for non-violent crimes, such as forgery. The second group's list included 10 men arrested for violent crimes, such as assault. Later, both groups were asked how many men on their list had committed any sort of crime, and the second group overestimated the number. So how to move away from prejudice? If your own gut check reveals you sometimes have feelings you would rather not have about other people, remember this: it is what we do with our feelings that matters. By monitoring our feelings and actions, and by replacing old habits with new ones based on new friendships, we can work to free ourselves from any prejudices we may have. So prejudice is an unjustifiable, usually negative attitude toward a group and its members. Prejudice's three main components are beliefs, which are often stereotypes, emotions, and predispositions to action, which we call discrimination. Explicit, which is overt, observable prejudice, in North America has decreased over time, but implicit prejudice, sort of an unthinking knee-jerk response below our conscious awareness, still does continue to some extent. Psychologists study implicit prejudice by testing for unconscious group associations, considering unconscious patronization, and monitoring reflexive bodily responses. Prejudice involves both explicit and implicit negative attitudes towards people of a particular racial or ethnic group, gender, sexual orientation, or even a belief system. The roots of prejudice include social inequalities and divisions. Higher status groups often justify their privileged position with the just world phenomenon. We tend to favor our own group, that in-group bias, as we divide ourselves into us and them, so the in-group versus the out-group. Prejudice can also be a tool for protecting our emotional well-being, as we focus our anger by blaming events on a scapegoat, on some other group. The cognitive roots of prejudice grow from our natural ways of processing information, forming categories, remembering vivid cases, and believing that the world is just, and that our own and our group's ways of doing things are the right ways. Monitoring our feelings and actions, as well as developing new friendships, can help free ourselves from some prejudices. So that is the end of this module. Thank you for listening. Take care.